We're now going to move into stage 3 of the 5 stages of OD, basically the diagnostic process, and really kind of trying to identify all of the parts and all the data that you need to make appropriate decisions within an organization for your interventions. So again, in the 5-stage model, we've anticipated the need for change, so the ball has been rolling in stage 1. Stage 2, we've identified the key components as far as within the organizational structure, who the clients are, who the practitioners are, hopefully we are one of those, and also who are the people that are actually going to be implementing the process. So who are the key stakeholders, what are the elements that are in play, and is there the proper relationship between those elements to really increase the likelihood of success? So moving beyond that phase, we're now into the diagnostic phase of really actually kind of second guessing. So stage 1 was something needs to change, and we see a problem, and here's the problem. Stage 2, the implementation is rolling forward. A team is being created, or a team is being tapped, if you will, to start an intervention to fix this problem. Well, as we move into stage 3, we actually kind of take a step back and go, okay, now let's actually find out, is there the problem? And if there is the problem, is it the problem we think it is? So we're basically checking our assumptions at this phase and trying to gather objective data on what's actually going on in the organization. So we're trying to diagnose the problem areas. We want to identify areas for improvement. We want to access current performance and desired levels of quality. We want to provide information that allows for faster reacting organizations. And we want to analyze data on the organization's structure, administration, interaction, procedures, interfaces, and other elements. So really what we're wanting to do, broadly speaking, is what are the areas of the processes in the organization that could be improved? In those processes, what is the current marker or benchmark of performance, and what is the desired level of quality or quantity in that area? So where is the actual outcomes at, and where do we want to see those outcomes move towards? So if we're changing a process, what was the process in the past resulting in, and what is this new process we're hoping to result in? We want to provide information that then allows for a faster reacting organization. So not only do we want to change that process, we want to change it in a way that it'll also be more reactive in the future and more able to change as needed. And as a part of that, we need to decide within that area for improvement, what are the major elements that we can affect? What is the structure of this process? What is the administrative or managerial parts of this process? What are the interpersonal interactions of this process? What are the policies and procedures that are involved in this process? What kind of other interfaces or secondary impacts will this process change have? In other words, beyond the process itself, does it impact or interface with other processes in the organization? And finally, just a broad catch-all of any other elements. So part of the diagnostic process is really kind of going through this 3 steps and then trying to quantify what's actually all of the moving pieces, if you will, that we're trying to actually impact with this intervention. So the steps in diagnostic broadly are 9 steps. We first have the tentative problem identified, and that usually occurs in step 1 and step 2 of the 5-step process. Step 2, we want to actually collect data. So we actually want to get in and actually find out, do we have clear objective data or even subjective data that illustrates that this problem actually is occurring? Once we collect that data, we want to actually analyze the data and determine, is there actually evidence to support our assumption of this tentative problem? Do we need feedback on that data? So let's take a look at what we gathered, and do we need more data? So a part of the analyzing process is also asking, did we collect enough information to make a reasonably logical choice of how to proceed? If more data is needed, we continue that process and go back to step 2 again in kind of a feedback loop until we feel that we have enough information to make an informed decision. We then want to readdress the problem. So what was the problem that the data identified, and does that map well on to the tentatively identified problem that started this ball rolling? Now, if it turns out that the problem that has been identified differs from that tentative problem, we go to step 7. Can we still keep the client motivated to change and to accept this finding of the data? We then diagnose and work on the actual problem itself based on the data. And finally, we actually do the intervention. And now, because we did that initial data collection, we have the information of what was it like before the intervention. We can use that as our benchmark to find improvement for monitoring and assessing the results of the intervention. Step 9. Another way to view this is the 9-step process is the flow chart that I present here. So we have the tentative problem, which initiates the need to collect data, to analyze data, to determine if we have enough data. If we have enough data, we move on to step 6. If not, we keep the cycle going through 2, 3, and 4. And finally, when we feel that we have enough information, we then actually ask, what does the data say as far as what the problem is? We then have to ask, is the client motivated to work on the problem? And there may be a no. It may turn out, oh, we thought there was a problem with recruitment. Turns out our recruitment process is good. The problem actually is with retention, but quite honestly, we're not willing to put time and effort into a retention intervention at this point. OD stops at that point, unfortunately. No change at present. However, if the client goes, oh, we thought it was a retention problem, turns out it's a recruitment problem, turns out it's a retention problem, well, fine, we'll do a retention intervention. Then we're moving on now to use that data to diagnose the problem, to create the intervention, and because we've done the data collection, we have that benchmark to determine what do we want to see as far as a change. And generally that change is what we often refer to as a performance gap. So by doing that pre-data gathering, we're actually getting information of current actual performance. And that can be actual performance of individuals, that can be team success, that can be amount of sales. It can be anything that the organization is valuing and is something that they want to see as an objective change. And then we need to determine, so what is the goal of the intervention? What is the desired performance that we're trying to move the organization towards? The difference between actual and desired performance is the performance gap, and that performance gap should be addressed by our intervention. Another way to look at this also as a part of this data gathering, and we're going to talk a little bit of how to gather the data and what data should be gathered. One of the things that we should be gathering as far as data is a self-assessment of the gap analysis. And the 4 key areas that we can look at to analyze why there's a gap between performance and current performance and desired performance is to basically make a list of what are the organization's strengths. And that can be an organizational level list. It could also be specifically, for example, if the intervention is targeting a specific team. Let's say the sales team needs to redo how they're doing their process. So what are the sales team's strengths? What can be done? So how can the intervention actually take advantage of these strengths? So we really want to recognize what is being done well or what strengths are already there in the organization that we can build on. Because one of the reason we're doing this is to make sure that our intervention is not basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to throw away the good with the bad. We want to identify the good, retain it and reward it, and then look for, now, where are the weaknesses? Where are the processes that could be done better? It could be more efficient, could actually result in closing that performance gap. And now, how can our intervention both take advantage of those strengths, but also alleviate those weaknesses? And this is going to be the guiding principles of almost any intervention where you're wanting to actually implement in an organizational development situation. So the data collection process, data is an aggregation of signs, signals, clues, facts, statistics, opinions, assumptions. Basically, information is data that have form and structure. So we want to gather everything we can. Signs can include memos within the organization. They can involve news stories. They can involve external and internal events. Signals can again be kind of organizational decisions and memos that have gone out. Clues and facts really are just trying to gather information from the main stakeholders. So talking to the actual clients that are driving this change. So what do you see as the problems? How do you view this problem? But also looking at the actual stakeholders that are involved in the process. So the people that are going to be targeted for the intervention, what are their viewpoints? How do they see the process? Where do they see the problems? Statistics can include objective statistics, so objective statistics on actual performance, sales date ratios, turnover information, retention information, promotion information. It can also include performance reviews, so anything that you can look at that gives you numbers that you can then track for improvement moving forward. Opinions and assumptions, we'll often do surveys at this point of all key stakeholders, especially if probably part of the problem is attitudinal, such as engagement of the workers, job satisfaction of the workers, commitment of the workers. We'll want to know what the current levels of those kind of psychological constructs are. The data collection stages, the first thing we need is a definition of our objectives. So in order to know what data we need to collect, we need to know what we're actually wanting to change. So what system is being analyzed? So what are the objectives of our eventual change program? We want to identify preliminary diagnosis, but we also have to recognize further information will usually be required. So we do know that we have some thoughts of what's going on, but we want to make sure that that presumption or that preliminary diagnosis doesn't guide our data collection. We want to let the data tell us what's actually happening. We want to select key factors that need to be measured. We need to identify central variables. We want to identify the people that we need to talk to and the data that we need to gather. And we may find, especially through that process, so remember there's an iterative process where we're collecting data, but we're also asking, do we have enough data? We may often need to increase the range and depth of data to really get a good answer of what needs to be done. And then we need to select the data gathering methods. We often want to use multiple methods. The nature of the problem will often help us determine methods, and we will talk a little bit more about types of methods of data collection. The variety of methods may be used, and this includes interviews, focus groups, survey information, and also archival organizational information. So types of data gathering methods include secondary sources, so organizational and industry data, basically what I referred to as archival data, information about the environment in the organization exists in, employee surveys or questionnaires. Data may lack richness with surveys and questionnaires because they're usually made to collect a lot of numerical data and responses to various questions on a numerical scale, so they often need to be supplemented with interviews or focus groups. We can also do sociograms, and I'll talk about those briefly on the next slide, but basically it's actually this is harder to do with very large organizations, but when our intervention is targeting, for example, a small department or a small team, this is often a very useful way to identify potential communication problems that our intervention may want to focus on. We probably want to do a fair amount of direct observation. So observing how people are actually currently doing the processes is in the part of the status quo. And we definitely want to do interviews. Direct, they're personal, they're flexible, they allow us to really gather rich data. So just going back to the sociogram for a moment. An example of a sociogram is basically what we want to look at is usually this can be done with surveys, it could also be done informally with interviews. You want to ask people who they primarily communicate with in their department or on their team. So basically we ask each person in a given week or a given month, how many times do you have interactions with each person on your team? So for each person on their team, they will rate how many interactions they have. They'll also rate the quality of the interactions and often sometimes the type of interactions, social versus organizational tasks. We can then use that information to basically identify who are key personnel that everyone's dealing with. We often refer to those as stars. What groups tend to communicate amongst themselves more often than anyone else? We'll call those cliques. And also, are there certain individuals that have very limited interaction with the rest of the group? Those we will usually refer to isolates. We can also then determine, it's interesting to do these because often you would assume whoever's the team lead or the project manager very possibly may be the star, and that's not necessarily always the case. So in my own psychology department, if you did this for us, you would find that there would be basically 4 cliques, 3 of them based on graduate programs, 1 of them based on a group of very close friends. You would find that those cliques have some interactions with each other, but for the most part, most interactions are within those cliques, and none of the faculty or individual cliques have that much connection necessarily with the actual chair or the manager of the program. They would probably come out somewhat as an isolate, as for the most part, we're fairly autonomous in how we actually do our jobs. Now, this would also then indicate, if someone was doing a sociogram of our department, that if there was a need for change that was being driven by our chair, the chair would actually have a bit of a challenge in being able to drive that completely by themselves. However, knowing that that's the layout of the social organization of this department, you would be able to go, but the chair could try to convince the 3 stars or 4 stars of each clique to come on board with his plan. And in fact, that's how our program is basically set up. Each graduate program's director is actually in an advisory committee that works then closer with the chair. And the chair then works through us to actually get most information out to the program itself. So this really can give you a lot of information and a lot of data on potential communication problems. And often when we're looking at OD interventions, one of the things we're probably trying to affect is the success and efficiency of communication within any particular process within the organization.